Can we zoom in on the housing problem? Can you explain the housing problem and what's the importance of housing in in the quality of life, in the flourishing of the nation of the United States in general, and what is broken about it?
Let's say the second part of the question first. What's so important about housing? We're talking about life. And even at a higher level, we're kind of talking about freedom. Like the freedom to live where you want to live, the freedom to feel like the good and achievable life is actually good and achievable. This is profoundly a question of housing. There's this great paper that was written several years ago called The Housing Theory of Everything by Bauman, Southwood, and I forget the other guy's name. But they made this really beautiful point that no matter what you care about in terms of public policy or politics, housing probably makes contact with it. If you care about innovation, as I said, is about getting people together in a city where they can work together. That's about housing density. If you care about childcare costs, that's about bringing down the cost of buildings. That's also about housing. If you care about being able to live near your friends and family, this is also profoundly a question of housing. So when we talk about housing over and over, we're not just talking about the four walls and roof and floor. We're talking about what housing means to people because housing is life. And right now, what we very clearly see in the data is that Americans are leaving expensive cities and states that tend to be run by Democrats, and they're moving to areas that are sunnier, that are cheaper, and are often more likely to be run by Republicans. And this is, I think, because starting in the 1960s, 1970s, you had this era of blockage points in housing. We started seeing zoning regulations. We started seeing historic preservation rules. We started seeing laws that made it easier for citizens to sue to stop a new development from going up. Essentially, new tools were invented to empower people's natural conservatism. For hundreds of years, people might have always felt like, I kind of want my neighborhood to stay the same. Like that might have been something that like the Neanderthals were feeling. But only in the last 50 years have we really outfitted human beings with a weapon to go along with their biological preference for the familiar, such that they can utilize it to stop the change of the physical world around them. And so we've seen the rise of what is commonly called nimbyism, not in my backyard, the rise of a movement to stop the development of new housing around where they live. And so what you see in the data is, according to one study that was reported on by Yoni Applebaum, my colleague at The Atlantic, if there's a city with a 10% increase in the progressive vote share, there's a 30% decline in the number of houses that are permitted. For some reason, it does tend to be these areas that are more populated by progressives that have more of these choke points. Some of this is just historical quirk, but some of it is, I think, maybe the character of a certain kind of liberal, maybe often an older liberal, who believes that preserving the physical environment is the good. That the best thing you can do for the planet is to stop things from changing around you, stop things from being built. And that's an old-fashioned version of environmentalism that we're trying to turn the liberals against. Because really we see the challenge with climate change is not how do we get everybody to stop using electricity? How do we get people to stop using any power or joules or electrons that come from natural gas and oil? We want people to recognize that if the people want to lead modern lives, and they're going to continue to demand modern lives, and so we have to use clean energy technology to allow them to live those lives. That means you have to build an absolute shit ton of new clean energy, solar and wind and geothermal and nuclear, and maybe in the near future, even fusion. It requires an attitude of being excited about building new things rather than a liberalism that seeks always to block changes to the physical environment around them. So I think that what we're trying to do is to allow people in a way to meet processes and outcomes. I think liberals want housing abundance at some in some part of their brains, in some part of their hearts. I think they want the price of housing to go down. But there hasn't quite been a really clean articulation of a mindset or paradigm shifting argument that gets them to see how the processes that we've created go so dramatically against the outcomes that liberals want. And we're trying to say, here's a new process. Here's a new question you can ask yourself. How can we solve the housing problem on the supply side?
And also, solving the housing problem is one of the mechanisms to lift people out of poverty. So there's a lot of goals that align well with liberals. You write about cities Cities are where wealth is created, not just where it is displayed. They are meant to be escalators into the middle class, not penthouses for the upper class. So the housing problem we're talking about specifically, or most importantly, is in urban areas.
Yeah, this is something that we spent a lot of time thinking about for the book. There's a lot of land in the United States. And sometimes you'll hear people say something like, I've heard this a lot. Well, not everybody can live in San Francisco or Venice in Los Angeles or, Manhattan or Brooklyn or whatever. And fine, right? Not everybody can. That's true. The problem is that cities are engines of opportunity and economic dynamism. I mean, as you know better than we do, the frontier AI labs in the US, basically all of them outside of China, exist in 50 square miles in the Bay Area. There's not one in New York. There's not one in Dallas. There's not one in Chicago. There's not one in Austin. There's not one anywhere but in the Bay Area. But the key thing is that there is huge spillover from these hyperdynamic industries, be it finance in New York, be it tech in San Francisco, be it culture in Los Angeles. You make a lot more money being a barber near Google than you do being a barber in, rural Arkansas. And this is the ancient pathway to mobility. People who are poorer and work in the service sector, they move to richer areas where the productivity is higher, and thus the sort of money spreads around. And if you look at American mobility and opportunity over the 20th century, about a third, roughly, on some calculations, just comes from this people moving to richer areas. And if you look in like the last 20-ish years, 30-ish years, you see this extremely steady process of income convergence as people move towards richer areas begin to throw itself into reverse. Because it used to make sense for the janitor and the lawyer to move to New York City. But now it only makes sense for the lawyer to, and the janitor leaves. Because you can't support yourself and your family and live in a home and have a reasonable commute being a janitor working in Manhattan. Now, obviously, some people do it, and it's often very tough, and they live very far. It's very hard in San Francisco. You can't look at cities as, well, that's just where the rich people are. And that's a problem that many Democrats now have. I mean, Michael Bloomberg famously described New York City as a luxury good, and luxury goods cost luxury prices. And that's true in the sense that New York became a luxury good, but that's a problem. Like, that is a terrible problem and an inversion of what the city is. There's this famous advice, possibly apocryphally, from Horace Greeley, who's a kind of, early American newspaper publisher and political candidate. But he says, like, go west, young man, go west, right? The opportunity is out in the west where the lands are open. It's never been true, including for him. That guy moved from a rural area to New York City. And that's how he became famous. And he ran a newspaper, and he ran against Ulysses S. Grant in a presidential election. The cities are the frontier. The cities have always been the frontier, not of the land, but of the economy. Because the frontier of the economy is where ideas are produced. And ideas, even now, even in the age of remote work, are produced in the big cities where people live together. And they compete with each other, and they cooperate with each other. And so if you gate the cities, if you make it impossible for someone making $50,000 with 2 kids to live in the city, then what you've done is you've actually closed the American frontier. You have forced them into lower productivity places. Their children are less likely to grow up around, the sort of inventors in the cities. There's really amazing research from Ross Chetty and others, basically showing that kids, no matter what they are, no matter what income class they're in, they are likelier to grow up innovating and patenting in the innovations of the place around them. Right? Smart kids don't just grow up and innovate in anything. If they grew up in the Bay Area, they innovate in technology, as Steve Jobs did and Wozniak did, right? Because they just lived around those people. And that is true in many, many, many different things. And so when you gate the cities, housing is almost too small of a thing for what we're talking about. We're talking about if you can live next to economic opportunity. We are talking also about if you can put the people together who will create the next era of economic opportunity. Right now, the Bay Area is still in some ways drafting off the back when it was cheap. A lot of the people we're talking about who have made amazing things there, they started in the Bay Area when you could afford to live there. It wasn't always like this, and it wasn't that long ago that it wasn't like this. And now, fine, you can go there if you have money or you have a great job offer from Google or Apple or whomever. But over time, you need the ferment. I have like a personal interest in reading memoirs and noticing if the memoir is really a housing story. One of the ones I like about this, Moby, the electronic musician, his first memoir, which is great. It's a memoir of a certain era in New York. It's a housing story. He was just living next to a bunch of other musicians in cheap-ass housing. I just read Meet Me in the Bathroom by Lizzie Goodman, a sort of oral history of the aughts rock revival in New York City. A housing story. They could afford to live here, right? I've read a bunch of these in San Francisco too, where people just like, they're functionally squatting, right? Like the San Francisco ferment, its queerness, its openness and tolerance of new ideas. It's sort of like it's home of the psychedelic counterculture that intermixed with the defense culture that created Silicon Valley, right? You've read probably, is it Frederick Turner's from Counterculture to Cyberculture? That was a story of cheap housing. You need to allow people to be around each other, to mix each other. If only one type of person can afford to be there, it becomes a monoculture over time. And so it's not just housing. This is about the geography of economic innovation and opportunity. That's why it's so fucking important.
Yeah. I mean, that's so brilliantly put that, the economic dynamism and the intellectual dynamism that makes America, I think, the greatest nation on earth, is at the core housing story. It's like you have to live near the place where there is turmoil and turbulence, intellectually and economically speaking. And so, like, you want to be able to move there and, like, be part of that culture, part of that economy, and part of that, like, how you raise your kids and culturally what you want them to study, you want them to do. Yeah, that's fascinating. So how do we solve the housing problem? Is it just remove as much regulation as possible? Like, get out of the way?
There's certainly a lot of regulation that you want to get out of the way. I mean, you look at California, for example, you were just giving a beautiful summary of just how important it is for people to be able to move next to economic opportunity. If you look at the number of houses that have been permitted in the state of California, over the last 40 years, it's basically just a squiggle line down. Yeah. Like the tragedy here, just to put a really fine point on it, is that the city wasn't gated by geography or by destiny.
By technology. We know how to build apartment buildings.
Yeah. Elijah Otis invented the elevator in like the 1850s. Mm-hmm. This is not exactly a breaking technology. We chose to do this. We wrote these laws. We people are filing these lawsuits. We judges are accepting these lawsuits and determining that this building can't be built. This is entirely self-inflicted, and it's why over and over again in this book, we call it a manufactured scarcity, which is like a little bit of a funny term. How do you manufacture the absence of something? No, a manufactured scarcity means you didn't have to do this. This is a human-made rule whose purposeful goal was to make it harder to add to the supply of something. And in this case, especially since the 1960s, we have made it purposefully difficult to add housing supply. And the outcome just followed the process. You see housing supply decline, often in the richest cities and these states that are governed too often by progressives. How do we undo it? Yes, a huge part of it exists at the layer of law. Right? California is already trying to change its laws, right? End single-family zoning, make it easier to add accessory dwelling units called ADUs. We're changing this at the level of law. But one thing I'm very fixated on is making sure that we also communicate to people that it has to be changed at the level of mindset and even at the level of political courage. Because here's like a model of what often happens. You're the mayor of some city, and you want to add a housing development of, let's say, 500 units, right? 500 apartment unit building is going to be set up by some developer. And there's a city council meeting to determine whether or not this apartment building is going to be built. Because of loss aversion, and because the people who tend to go to city council meetings are older and richer and homeowners, guess what the overwhelming volume of reaction is in those city council meetings? It's a lot of people who feel like they have something to lose, saying you cannot put up this building. You cannot add these apartments. It's going to ruin the character of the neighborhood. It's going to create traffic. It's going to be like an eyesore because I don't like buildings that are that tall. Any number of excuses can come out of like the Pez dispenser of excuses. You take care of one, there's going to be another that comes to the surface. And so what often happens is that these mayors or these people sitting on the city council will look out into this room of 50 people saying, no, no, no. And they'll say, I'm going to represent the feedback that I see, and I'm going to vote no on the addition of this housing on the addition of these housing units, the addition of this apartment building. Where political courage comes into play is the ability to say, you know what? I want everyone here to know that I hear you. I'm listening to you and I represent you. And so I'm grateful that you showed up to the city council meeting. But for every one person here who says they see a benefit to adding a new apartment building, I know that there are 10,000 people in the city that didn't have the wealth or the knowledge to be here at this meeting. And they're going to benefit from more housing because that's going to bring down their housing costs. And I represent them as well. I don't just represent, you could say, the circle of care that I can see right now. I also represent the circle of voters that we can't see right now, who are in the city or who are in the state or might even want to move to the state but currently can't because housing prices are too high on account of housing supply being restricted. And so one thing we're trying to get liberals to have is a sense of political courage to stand up against this very visible nimbyism and say, we represent interests that aren't necessarily visible at this city council meeting. We represent the larger interest of housing abundance. So we're going to always default to saying yes rather than default to saying no just because the people who happen to come to these meetings are NIMBYs.
I want to add a wrinkle on regulation and deregulation. So we were talking about coding earlier. Who gets coded as right wing, who gets coded as left wing. Deregulation is a word that is highly coded as right wing. The right wing wants it to deregulate, right? They want the government to stop regulating the market. It's fine. In many cases, the government should deregulate parts of the market. In many cases, it should regulate parts of the market more. What we don't talk about enough is how much the government regulates the government and how badly it needs to deregulate the government. So I have many more left friends, and they'll come to me or they'll critique me and they'll say, this all is fine, but what we really need in this country is public housing, or it's been rebranded social housing. It's fine. Singapore, huge amount of social housing, right? They do a great job with it. One of the things we go into, and this book is a manifesto on some level, but something we really try to do is take you into the gritty, grimy, frustrating details of how policy plays out on the ground. What actually happens after a bill passes and why we get the outcomes we do. Because often it's like a bunch of decisions made after everybody stopped paying attention. So one of the things we pay some real attention to is the kind of housing that people on the left all agree on is affordable housing through government grants, right? The government says, oh, we're not just going to have market rate developers coming in building more luxury condos for the children of the upper class. We're going to build affordable housing for, people who should be in this city, but otherwise couldn't pay enough to be here. California. I can give you two different examples, but let's look at Los Angeles. I'm from outside LA, and they have something. I always forget if it's Measure H or Measure HHH, but California, LA voters pass a bond measure. About $1 billion, a little bit more, I think it was, to build affordable housing. 6 years later, when I'm writing about this, they have built a couple thousand units at an average cost of $600,000 to $700,000 a unit. So it's costing more to build housing under this affordable housing bond measure, which they have agreed to pay for, than it is to buy a home market rate in Denver. Denver's a nice place to live. So why? What had happened? Well, it turns out that when you trigger the public money in California, in various cities, these are city ordinances often, but not always, and you use these public grants and you cobble together the different grants you need to build an affordable housing complex, what you've done is layer onto yourself a huge number of rules that the market rate developers don't have to follow. You're either using union labor or paying prevailing wage. You're building to higher green building codes. Oftentimes, by the way, to get through the kind of planning board meetings that Derek is talking about, you've made a bunch of concessions on the design. Is there going to be parking in it? Security, things like that. You have to often agree to who's going to be in the home. So you're getting, there's a thing in the Measure H stuff where, well, they wanted it to not just be the taxpayer money. They also wanted nonprofit grants so the money would go further. So you're trying to get these other grants, but these grants are to house homeless veterans. So now to open the thing, you need to find these homeless veterans. You need to go through extra disability accessibility reviews. And of course, we all want these things to be accessible, but they already had to comply with the American Disability Act. But now you're doing another Disability Act review in the city. And they come in, they say, well, your doors are a little bit not as wide as we think. So you got to make all your doors 3 inches wider before you can open up, and that adds time and that adds cost. You have these subcontractor rules, right? This is now, I'm using an example from San Francisco, but you had a preference initially for minority-based subcontractors. That became illegal. It became small businesses, but that meant it had a preference against the bigger contractors who are more efficient at building housing. In order to use public money, and then very much in order to build public housing directly, it ends up being more expensive and slower than market rate. And that is a choice. We do not have to try to solve every problem in society through an individual housing project. Building affordable housing is hard enough. It's not impossible, but it's difficult to do. You do have to talk with the neighbors, right? It's never going to be trivial to build 500 unit apartment building, but instead we layer on all these external and additional agenda items. I call this everything bagel liberalism, because you sprinkle just enough on the bagel and it's great. But if you saw everything everywhere all at once, you put everything on the everything bagel and it becomes a black hole from which nothing can escape. And so the need to deregulate government, right? Why I saw some of Elon Musk's marathon appearance on your show, and he talks about high-speed rail in California. And the thing he says there, that it's functionally illegal to build high-speed rail in California. I got 100 disagreements with Elon Musk right now. That's not one of them. It's functionally illegal to build high-speed rail in California. I went out, I toured the high-speed rail. I've done a lot of reporting on that. You can't build it affordably. You just can't on time. They have no way to get the money to build the rest of it. It's not going to happen. And it's not going to happen not because you can't build high-speed rail. Europe builds high-speed rail, Japan builds high-speed rail, China builds high-speed rail. And it's not because of the private market, we'll only build luxury high-speed rail. It's because we have so heavily regulated a public project that you can't finish it. And you definitely can't bring it in on time and affordably. And so I really would like to uncode deregulation, because there's places where I would like to regulate more. I don't want you to be able to build a coal-fired power plant in America. I just don't want it to be possible. I think it's bad. But I do want it to be possible to build high-speed rail and affordable housing, including through the public market. And one thing my friends on the left, I think, really underrate is how hard they've made it for the government to act. They believe in government, but if you believe in government, then you have to make it possible for government to complete projects. You have to make it possible for the people who work for government to apply their own genius and initiative. They have to have agency. I always say that we're sort of trapped right now between a party that wants government to fail and a party that won't make government work. And we are trying to push this idea that the thing we want is a capable government, a strong government, a government that when it promises it will do something, it actually does it and gets it done. And that requires not just deregulation of the private sector, though sometimes it does require that. It requires deregulation of the government itself.
I love this question of deregulation. But I also sometimes find it very frustrating, because sometimes I find that people's sense of regulation is so specifically coded. Regulation is just rules. If you change the word from regulation to rules, I think it'd be easier for people to see some rules are good and some rules are stupid. We all understand that in life. That's what regulations are. They're just rules. And sometimes they give us exactly the outcomes we want, and sometimes they give us the outcomes we would never hope for. And here's a good example. You go back to the 1940s, 1950s. America was fucking disgusting. Disgusting. The air and the water was horrifying. In 1943, residents of Los Angeles woke up to a smog that was so black, they thought the Japanese had launched a chemical attack against America. In New Hampshire, in the rivers next to textile mills, sometimes the rivers themselves would run green and purple and red, depending on what textile colors were being dumped into the river. You had the Ohio River on fire in the 1960s, 1970s. The world of mid-1900s America was truly sickening, and it made people sick. And so we passed a raft of environmental rules, and some of them achieved exactly what we wanted. The air we breathe and the water we drink is cleaner because of the Clean Air and Water Acts. We did extraordinary things with this era of regulation. Some of these regulations were about outcomes, like the Clean Air and Water Act regulates specific pollution levels in the air and the water, or the emissions coming out of tailpipes. Some of the regulations, though, were about process. NEPA is the National Environmental Protection Act, and it, among many other things, empowered individuals and citizens to sue the government and organizations, businesses, to stop construction or fill out environmental reviews to prove that their construction would meet muster, wouldn't degrade the environment too severely. This opened the door to an infinitude of lawsuits to wrap up any effort to build anything in red tape forever. So fast forward to 2021, the month after Gavin Newsom, governor of California, signs the law to end single-family zoning in California. Seems like a massive win for the pro-housing YIMBYs of California. The month after that law was passed, the Board of Supervisors in San Francisco decided to rule against an apartment building that would have added 500 total units and 100 below market rent units, so something like public or social housing, that was going to be built on a Nordstrom parking lot, just about the best possible place you could add housing in the world, a Nordstrom parking lot, because the builders, the developers, didn't file the appropriate paperwork under environmental review. So this is a world in which the most housing-starved city in America is being starved even more of housing because of the expression of, or the power of, the instrumentalization of a rule passed in the 1970s that has allowed people to sue to stop the physical world from being changed. And I think it goes back to this idea that, like, sometimes the solutions of one era can become the problems of the next generation, right? It was really good to pass the set of environmental bills that we did in the 1960s and 1970s because it addressed the extremely real problem of air and water and land being degraded by industry. But we're in a new world. And the problem environmentalism today is in part a problem of global warming. And we have to build not only dense housing, but also clean energy. And the same rules that were designed to help the environment in the 1960s and 1970s are sometimes ironically used in a way that hurt the environment in the 2020s. And that's one reason why we, as liberals, need a paradigm shift.
Okay, you said a lot of really interesting insights there. So one, if I understood correctly, that regulation of outcomes is more a good idea than regulation of process, because regulation of process is where you can breed a lot of, basically, the lawyers show up. The other insight is if we get rid of 99% of lawyers, the world would be a better place. There's a lot of jokes around that. I don't know if you agree, but that
I definitely wouldn't say 99%.
98.
Yeah, 82.3 to be absolutely
in the 80s.
No.
Okay, majority of them. No, they're simply there to take advantage of the rules.
We talk a lot about a book. I don't know if you've run into this one, but it's by Mansur Olson, who's sort of a founder of public interest economics, and it's called The Rise and Decline of Nations. This is a very famous book. Libertarians love this book, and I love this book. It's not right about everything, but its fundamental question is, how come after World War II did the completely destroyed, bombed out countries of Germany and Japan, you would have thought they would be just screwed. And instead, they both become growth miracles. They both do much better than the UK, which, was on the winning side of the war. Why? And Olson's argument is that affluent, stable societies over long periods of time develop something that is very difficult to develop and very important to develop, which is bargaining organizations, right? Collective action is hard. It is hard to form an organization. It is hard to make that organization persist. But if you can do that in an atmosphere of stability, then over time, that organization will tend to entrench its power, right? Think about AARP or the Chamber of Commerce or certain unions or, the National Manufacturing Council, et cetera, the Business Roundtable. They're not that powerful when they start, but over long periods of time, they become really powerful and they start to pass laws that make themselves more powerful and so on. There's a lot you can say about this insight, but my favorite part of Olson's book, and one that I don't think people emphasize enough, is this insight he has, which is that over time, every country has a kind of form of natural selection within it. And that form of natural selection will select for people with the skills to best navigate the kind of economy that country has. So if you're in China right now, and China's in its developmentalism phase, you really want to be in civil infrastructure. Right? It is great to be a civil engineer in China, great to be working on semiconductors in China, great to be doing all this stuff in the physical world. But America, as a kind of price of our affluence and our success, we've become a country, and this happens to a lot of countries, where negotiation is really important. And a country in which negotiation is really important is going to, over time, start developing a preference for lots of lawyers, people in finance, management consultants, because it is a society that requires continuous, what he calls complex bargaining. And I think this actually explains a lot. Patrick Collison, we quote him who's the CEO of Stripe, brilliant tech guy. He has this point that he made in an interview with Noah Smith, who's a blogger and economist, where they were talking about high-speed rail. And sort of Patrick makes this point. He's like, it's just tough to be a high-speed rail engineer in America. You're going to have a much easier time working in the digital space. And so the digital space becomes a kind of frontier of last resort. And so people want to build things, go into bits and bytes, not into atoms, right? To use the old kind of Peter Thiel cut. And I think there's something to that. It's not that lawyers are bad. Some of the people I love most in this world are lawyers, and many lawyers do amazing, amazing work. But one reason we've selected for so many lawyers, and America has a lot of lawyers, is we became a society that needs a lot of lawyers because we are a society that is stable, affluent, and we've become very into bargaining. Donald Trump is a real estate developer. That's a relational business. The way real estate development works in this country, the reason you don't have all that many huge firms building housing in many, many states simultaneously is it requires a lot of relationships in the individual city you're in. And so, if you read, say, Maggie Haberman's great biography of Donald Trump, Confidence Man, which focuses a lot on his time as a real estate magnate in New York, you see, Donald Trump doesn't build a ton of stuff in other states. He actually builds in other countries sometimes, or more to the point, he puts his name on things built in other countries. But really what he did was build here. And he built here through his relationships with the New York political system. And so over time, societies that make building and construction and creation something that is the output of negotiations rather than very clear standards and rules where if you've done it, you can just do it. You get a lot of lawyers, you get a lot of management consultants, you get a lot of finance people because that's what society is selecting for. That's what you've made it possible to have agency and freedom in. That's what you need to do to do big things. This is coming from Nick Bagley, who's a University of Michigan law professor, but between Walter Mondale and Tim Walz, there's not a single person on a Democratic presidential ticket who didn't go to law school, not one. The Democratic Party in particular is a party of lawyers, and lawyers look at things through the legal perspective, and the legal perspective is that government is legitimate by following process. And Bagley's point is that government attains legitimacy, at least in part, through outcomes. And when you prize process so high over outcomes, you think you're acting legitimately, but actually what would have made you legitimate in the view of the people is that you built the thing you told them you were going to build. You made it possible to live affordably in the city. And so you have this sort of movement then over time to populist strongmen who say, I alone can fix it, because they've kind of given up on this procedural liberalism. That didn't deliver for them. So you keep telling them, we're the ones who know how to run government, and they don't see it. And eventually somebody else comes and says, I'm going to bust through the walls of this thing like the Kool-Aid man. And they win.